Okay, so let's recap the argument so far, right? In this lecture, I want to talk about, how Kant defines duty, but first let's see where we've been so far. The argument so far is the goodwill is the only thing that is unconditionally good. Step one, right? Step two, which we talked about in last lecture, step one we talked about in the lecture before, step two we talked about in the last lecture. The goodwill is the will that acts from duty. It does its duty not for ulterior motives or for other reasons, but it does its duty because it is its duty. Well, then, what is duty, though, right? We get another question. What is our duty? How do we define it? How do we know what it is? Well, Kant's tests of the categorical imperative are supposed to answer this question. All right. So Kant lists this in different ways, and there's some argument about how many of these there are. But for our purposes, there's only really two formulations of the categorical imperative we need to think about. The formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. And in this lecture, we'll talk about the formula of universal law. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the formula of humanity. And in the one after that, we'll talk about how these two relate. All right. Let's start with the formula of universal law, though. And now, to understand what the formula of universal law is, you have to kind of understand Kant's jargon. And a key term in Kant's jargon, and one I'm not going to use any more than I have to because I don't think it clears things up, but a key term in Kant's jargon is a maxim, this term maxim. Well, what is a maxim? Well, to see what a maxim is, I think you need to think about that every action has some reason behind it. Now, that reason might not be explicit. You might not think to yourself, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee because coffee's delicious and it will wake me up before class. You might just go, okay, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee. I want a cup of coffee. But if I ask you why you're doing it, you could give me the reason you do this, right? So every human action, everything that deserves to be called an action, has some reason or principle behind it. And so what a maxim is a pretty high level or abstract reason or principle, right? It's the general policy, the sort of high level reason behind an action, You get coffee because you want to be awake for class. That's not a maxim, but something like, well, I want to do what I can to further my education, or I want to do what I can to further my career. That's a maxim. That's high level. That's more abstract, right? And so the formula of universal law says, ask yourself what the maxim of an action you're thinking about is. If you want to know what duty is, whether you have a duty to do something or not to do it, ask yourself what the principle of the action you're considering is. Then ask yourself, could you will that everyone in similar circumstances follow your principle? If the answer is yes, then the action is at the very least permissible. It's okay to do it. If the answer is no, though, the action is wrong. You have a duty not to do this. Your duty duty says avoid doing this kind of thing. Well, how's this work? Well, there's two ways an action could fail the formula of universal law. One, you could not even imagine everyone successfully acting on the principle. People often call this the contradiction in conception. You don't need to know this jargon, just know that this is one way something could fail. Two, you can imagine everyone acting on the principle, but you could not really will that everyone do it. The contradiction in willing. Let's discuss each of these and show how some things might fail it. The contradiction in conception. You cannot even imagine everyone in similar circumstances successfully acting on your principle. The fact that you might be able to successfully act on your principle depends on the fact that not everyone does it. Let me give you an example, and this is Kant's example, but let's talk through it in a little more detail. Kant goes through it pretty quickly. Imagine that you are hard up. You need some money. And you think to yourself, well, I could lie to my friend. I'll tell him it's just a loan. Loan me $500 or $1,000 or whatever, and I'll pay you back in a month when I get, this whatever. You have no intention of paying him back, though. You just think, well, this guy won't sue me or anything, and I can just avoid him, right? Well, what's the principle of your action? When I need money, and I can get money by lying to someone, I will do it. Well, Kant would say, think about what would happen if everybody who needed money always did this. If every single person, whenever they needed money, this was their go-to thing. No one would ever lend anyone money. Or if they did, they would make darn sure you have to pay them back. Even your gullible friend wouldn't loan you money if everyone always lied about it and never paid it back. The very fact that you could maybe successfully lie to your friend to get money depends on the fact that not everybody does this. If everybody always lied to get money when they needed money, lying would be ineffective because either the person wouldn't lend you money or they would do something to make sure you had to pay them back. Fact you can successfully do it depends on the fact not everyone does. Let's think of some other examples and see how they fail this contradiction in conception. So the lying promise we've already looked at. Most forms of stealing fail this, right? Think about shoplifting, right? You're in a store, you see something you want it, you don't want to pay for it. Well, can you steal it, right? Is that moral? But what would happen if every single person who wanted something from the store always stole it? Well, every single store would have metal detectors, right? Not only would they have metal detectors, you'd probably have to have your bag searched, go through an x-ray machine like you're getting on an airplane, right? Or if not that, everything would be behind the counter and you'd have to ask for it. The fact you could maybe get away with shoplifting depends on the fact not everybody follows the principle you're thinking about. If everybody did, either they would have like anti-theft measures when you left the store that would catch everyone who tried to steal, or you'd just have to ask a salesperson for every single thing, right? And pay for it when you got it. The fact you could maybe shoplift successfully depends on the fact not everybody does it. If everybody tried to do it, nobody could successfully act on this principle. I guess this is also a form of stealing, but think about riding the subway without paying, right? In the US, they usually have turnstiles. If you ever go to Europe, a lot of subways, you just buy a card and randomly they'll check it and they'll fine you if you don't have the card, right? Now the thing is, if you ride the subway in at least in Germany, it's the only European country I've spent a lot of time in, but if you ride the subway in, say, Frankfurt in Germany a lot, you get a pretty good feel for what the guys who check the tickets look like and seem like, right? you see these two guys who look like they shouldn't be talking to each other. There's always two of them talking to each other and get on the train together. And one of them or both of them has like a little leather bag. That's the thing they use to, it's electronic to write you the ticket. If you don't want to pay, you see those guys get on, you just get off. Or better yet, when they start to ticket you and they say, "Oh, sir, do you have a ticket? Well, we're going to have to write you." The Germans, the reputation for being law-abiding is exaggerated, but here they really are law-abiding. Everybody hands over their ID. What you could always do is when the train pulls into a station, just be like, "Let me look for it," and the door opens and you just dash out, right? These guys are not going to chase you. I saw one kid do this and they just seemed flabbergasted that anybody would run. Like, had he levitated, they would have not been more surprised. Now look, I didn't do this, right? I did not ride the Frankfurt subway without paying. But, ask yourself, could you will that everybody do it, right? And again, the answer is no. If everybody always tried to ride the subway without paying, they would definitely have measures to make sure you couldn't. Either there just wouldn't be a subway because nobody pays for it, or if there were, they would make sure everyone always had to pay, right? If you go to Washington, D.C., if you want to get on the metro, there are these full-body turnstiles that you just literally could not jump over. If everybody always tried to ride the subway without paying, every subway system would look like that, if there were subways, right? The fact that anyone could maybe successfully ride the subway without paying depends on the fact that not everybody tries to do it. All right, let's look at the final one, cheating on an exam. Well, if everyone always tried to cheat on an exam, what would happen? If every single student tried to cheat, what would happen? One of two things, right? Either they would make darn sure you can't cheat. They'd have people in the rooms hovering over your shoulders, looking at you the whole time. Everybody would have to hand their cell phone in when they walk in the room. Or, if we allowed cheating, grades would just be meaningless, right? Grades wouldn't mean a darn thing. And if you cheat on an exam, presumably what you want is a good grade. If the grade was meaningless, well, you couldn't do that, right? If everybody always, if you were under constant surveillance, you couldn't cheat. If everybody cheated and we let them cheat, then grades would be meaningless and you just couldn't get what you want by cheating, right? Either way, the fact that you could successfully cheat, maybe, to get the grade you want depends on the fact not everyone does this. Not everyone even tries to do it. Now, contradiction in willing is a little different. You can imagine everyone successfully acting on the principle, but you could not will that they do so. How's this supposed to work? Well, Kant's example is failing to help others. Failing to help others when it is easy and has little to no risk. Imagine, to use a famous philosopher's example, this is from Peter Singer. He used it in a different context, but it's a good example, so I'm going to steal it. Imagine you see a kid drowning in shallow water. We'll say it's a kid, just, otherwise we have these questions, why is this person drowning in shallow water? And you could help them. Well, what principle would you be following if you didn't help? Something like, I will never help another person out, right? You hear somebody screaming, through your open window for help, maybe you don't have to run down and face the mugger or whoever yourself, but you should at least call the police, right? If you don't at least do that, what's your principle? Again, something like, I will never help another person out. Well, look, could you will that everyone follow the principle, I will never give any assistance to another person? No, right? You couldn't follow that because you very well might need help. given the human condition and our susceptibility to bad luck, you almost certainly will need help at some point. Hopefully it's not as anything as bad as like this, but you're probably going to need another person to help you out. You'd want them to do it. You couldn't will that no one ever help another person. Failing to develop our talents, being lazy is another example, right? Imagine this guy, we'll call him Blake, right? Imagine he's just super lazy. All he wants to do is sit around, smoke pot, and play video games. And now he has a trust fund that allows him to do this, but he's also a really talented person. He could, make great accomplishments, help people out if he just did a little bit of work, if he got a job, right? Well, look. He couldn't will that everybody be as lazy as he's thinking of being, right? If they were, well, he wouldn't have a trust fund, right? If they were, well, somebody has to make the video games, right? We can imagine a world where everybody is as lazy as he is, but even he couldn't will that everybody's that lazy. He wouldn't want to live in that world. Murder, assault, same thing, right? You can imagine a world maybe where people just murder people whenever they feel like it. You wouldn't will that as a universal law because you don't want to be murdered. The same goes for assault. So hopefully you guys get a good feel for how this formula of universal law is supposed to work. But now the outstanding question here, the thing you should ask yourself, is why we should define duty in this way. Aren't there other ways you could define duty? Doesn't Kant need to give us some reason to reject them? Argument by elimination, he's saying, well, this is what duty is. Doesn't he need to consider some other candidates? Some people will say your duty is to follow God's will. That's actually not an uncommon one. Or that your duty is to keep the commands set by your society and your place in it. To do what your role requires of you. If memory serves, I think this is the way, the Bhagavad Gita defines duty in this way, right? The main guy is wondering if he should go into this horribly destructive war, and in the end he decides he should because his duty, given his place as a warrior, his role, is to go to war, right? I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but it's the upshot, right? Philosopher in the Western tradition, this guy F.H. Bradley said something very similar, like, your duty is set by your role in your society. Why doesn't, you might not like this, right? But why does Kant not even consider it? Why would Kant reject it? I think he needs to say something more about, well, there's these other rival conceptions of what duty is. Why do you reject them and say, well, we define duty in terms of this formula of universal law? More importantly, perhaps, and definitely more generally, why is the formula of universal law so important? Why is it so important that everyone be able to follow your principle? I remember when I was in school, we took a field trip to this apple orchard, and one of the kids, snags an apple. So we go by and starts eating it, and the teacher yells at him, and she's like, I don't know what his name was. We'll call him Billy, right? She's like, Billy, why are you doing that? And he just kind of looks dumbfounded. She's like, what if everybody who wanted an apple took an apple? And he's supposed to run some Kantian universalization test. And he didn't say anything, right? Because, when I was in elementary school, at least for a few of those years, the teachers could still paddle you, and the teachers were often very frustrated people, and they liked paddling. They got off on it, right? You did not want to be paddled by these ladies. So he kept his mouth shut. And I kept my mouth shut too. But what I was thinking is, well, why should he care that not everybody can do it, right? Yeah, if everybody tried to steal an apple, they wouldn't let these school groups come in, or they'd guard their apples. But why should Billy care about that if he wants to eat an apple, right? Yeah, not everybody can do it, and I wouldn't want everybody to do it, but why should I care? So what if I could not will that everyone do it? I'm just willing that I do it, right? Why is it so important that everybody be able to follow this principle? For all that we've seen from the formula universal law, Kant doesn't give us an answer to that. Also doesn't give us an answer why we should define duty in this way. Well, his other formulation of the categorical imperative, we're going to think about the formula universal law, will, I think, start to answer these very important questions.